Hey guys, this is Fallout86 for Raise Your Edge, and welcome to playing versus the Big Blind Barrel Strategies. I prepared some poker theory and we'll mix that with some example hands, cause this is what you requested. We will talk which hands you want to bet on the turn and on the river, and which sizings we should use on the various runouts. So yeah, let's go. So first hand we have ace queen and open on the button, and the big blind calls. Flop is super dry, we have range advantage on this board texture, so as expected we should make a range bet on those board textures. So we bet and he makes the call. Turn now is the 9 in diamonds, and yeah, a lot of draws are coming in. I think you should know what is coming, and yes, we should definitely fire the second barrel and we should use a very big sizing. So on the turn we want to go ahead and start overbetting, or we should check when we don't like overbetting with our hand, and that's basically about it. No need to be afraid that our opponent has a hand like ace 9, ace deuce, ace 7, deuces or sevens. With most of those strong hands, besides ace 9, villain will go ahead and raise flop against our small range bet. So his turn range is mainly all the weaker pairs and only some flush draws, because with the strong suited connectors and strong suited broadways, he's not going to call preflop. He will through it preflop, and yeah, he has all the aces, and that's the reason why it is important to bet big again. So as you can see, it makes sense to overbet turn with our strongest aces and other super strong hands, and our opponent has mostly bluff catchers and we want to give him a tough time, and we also have a lot of draws on the turn, because on the turn we also want to bet hands like 10-8 suited, Jack-8 suited, 6-5 suited, and a lot of diamonds and spades. And on the turn the main thing is that our second pairs are always pot controlling. So when you have a hand like 10s, jacks, queens, kings, we are never ever betting turn. Protection is not a huge deal, cause the ace is already on the board and we just value town ourselves all the time when we start betting super weak hands like second pair. And the same applies to the weaker aces. Like I mentioned, he has all the aces in his range besides ace king, ace queen, and yeah, probably ace jack, maybe ace 10 suited, cause he's rolling with those hands vast majority of the time. So we have to be a bit cautious with ace 8 and lower. With those hands you also want to check most of the time, cause we need value bets on the river, and when you only have 10s, jacks, queens, kings to bluff catch on the river, that's just not enough. Plus you don't block ace x from villain's range when you want to bluff catch, cause even when you only have a very weak ace, we still block a stronger ace having an ace in our hand. Alright, we bet big as mentioned and he makes the call. Yeah, let's take a look in the theory. At first I would say we have 4 different hand categories. When we arrive on the turn we have really strong mate hands, so a good top pair or even a stronger hand. Then we have middling type hands, so we have a pair or strong ace high. We have all the draws, so gut shots, open and straight draws, front draw, back door flush draws, and yeah, what else is left? We also have air, pure air. This is when you have nothing, like 2 undercards, no flush draw, no gut shot, no nothing. So at first you should always think in which hand category am I right now? With a really strong mate hand, we have to bet again on the turn. There's basically no slow playing whatsoever with super strong hands. As in this scenario with ace queen, we just always overbet, always, and we never slow play. We have enough better hands to protect our checking range, and the stronger your hand, the more often you want to bet it. But where do I draw the line? Can I only bet top pair good kicker and better hands? And of course, you can also value bet weaker hands, especially when the turn is another overcard, but we'll go into more detail later on. Just make sure when you value bet that you always have more than 50% equity against villain's calling range. So you just open Aqualab, you put in your hand, and then you try to create a realistic turn calling range. You can ask yourself which hands you would call against a second barrel. And when you have more than 50% equity with your hand, you are basically good to go if you are not too optimistic with the ranges. Yeah, as a rule of thumb, you always value bet hands on the turn that can easily value bet the river on a brick. You should never check super strong hands like this. You just execute bet turn, bet river. Like I mentioned before, we have better hands to pot control on the turn and protect our checking range. River is the beautiful deuce in clubs. All the draws bricked, and now it's time to get him to value town. Yeah, it should be obvious, but we should definitely bet big with ace jack plus and all the better hands, and we still get called by a ton of worse. Just make sure you don't bluff all the king x suited hands on the river, cause yeah, we block his folding range a little bit. Because when we have those strong draws, villain cannot have those draws. And yeah, this means he has more ace-x hands and he will bluff catch a little bit more often. So we want to bluff our straight draws that unblock flush draws at first. So hands like jack 8, jack 10, 10 8, and basically all the weak no showdown value hands that we bet twice with. Those are really good bluff candidates on the river. So we want to bet with hands like 6-4, 5-4, 6-5, 8-5, and yeah, 8-6, and yeah, some 10 high, jack high, queen high flush draws, and that's basically about it. In those situations, you should try to visualize the main idea to get a better feeling for those situations. Alright, next spot we open jack 8 suited on the cutoff, and flop is 10-9-6. Two-tone, not too bad for our hand, and on the flop we get better hands to fold, so hands like deuces, threes, fours, fives, and yeah, even the 6 has a tough time against the big sizing, cause when he has a hand like king 6 or 5-6 in hearts, it's just not a fun spot to be in when you face a big bet. So he's definitely folding a ton of better hands when we bet jack high, and yeah, obviously also folding a lot of ace highs and king highs and queen high hands. And even if we get called, we still have a ton of equity. Yeah, the board overall is not the greatest, and he can also have all the strong hands. So hands like 9s, 6s, 10-9 suited, 7-8 suited, and 10s sometimes, depending on how wide he's rating pre. So we want to go with a big sizing on this board texture with good bluffs and strong value hands. And like I mentioned, jack 8 suited is a very nice bluff candidate. So we bet flop, and the turn now is the ace in hearts. Okay, what about draws? In general, we want to bet super often with our draws when we have or we pick up good equity on the turn. So for example, we pick up a backdoor flush draw and we have no showdown value. Yes, in general, that's a very powerful bluff candidate. When we bet our draws, we fold out better hands immediately. Cause when we bluff with our draw, villain will fold a lot of ace highs and pairs. So yeah, third pair, fourth pair, second pair. But you don't really try to bluff him off top pair on the turn, cause those hands are just a little bit too strong and our opponent will most of the time call with those hands. With some draws we also want to check turn, and often that are draws that have showdown value, so we don't get enough better hands to fold with our bluff. And we also want to have some flushes in our range when there is a front or flush draw. So when we check turn, we also want to have some flushes on the river. So when the flop has two hearts and we check turn, we want to have at least some strong flushes, hearts on the river. Otherwise, we can never really raise the river when the river is a heart, cause we can't have a flush and the big blind can have a lot of flushes. That's a problem in those situations. Yeah, what about the air? We still have a lot of airballs, right? And most of the time, when you're on the turn and you have nothing, you can just go ahead and check turn. I know it's tempting when there is an overcard on the turn just to barrel off, but this is the wrong strategy. And you just exploit yourself when you barrel too wide, cause you already have so many better bluffs. So on the turn, when you have nothing, you can just check, go to showdown, and with some parts from this air range, we can bluff river. That's definitely a thing. But if we bluff turn too often, we overbluff, and villain can just call down everything he wants, and he's just printing. And that's why we need a solid game plan in order to not exploit ourselves. So yeah, as mentioned, beautiful turn card. Sure, villain has some ace-ace hands in his flop check calling range, no question, but think about all his other holdings that he is continuing on the flop, cause he still has all the 9x, 10x, flush draws, straight draws, and so on. So on this turn, we want to polarize again. We have a lot of strong hands that we can value bet now. We have strong aces, two pairs, sets, straights, and we also have the strong draws. So yeah, flush draws, queen jack, king jack, that we also want to bet on the turn. When we have showdown value, we mainly want to pot control turn. We still beat his draws, and not too many better hands are folding on the turn. So please try to realize your showdown value. No need to represent the ace when you have showdown value. And yeah, of course, this also applies to a 10. So queen 10, king 10, second pairs, jacks, queens, kings. Those hands perform really well in our checking range, because not enough worse hands are calling our turn bet. We just have better hands to value bet, and there's just no need to turn our beautiful second pair into a bluff. So we bet turn again with jack 8 suited, and our opponent makes the call. Okay, river is the perfect brick, and we need to ask ourselves if we want to fire the third bullet. Yeah, as always, try to break down villain's range. With which hands will villain arrive on the river? And he can have some aces, yes. He can have some 10x hands, some pair plus draw hands, and yeah, he can have some flush draws, but he will not bluff catch with all those hands. His calling range will be mainly ace-ace on the river. It's also quite nice that he has not too many strong hands in his call flop, call turn range. With sets or straights, he is going to raise flop or turn, so he can't have too many strong hands in his call range. And we have a lot of hands that want to give up now on the river. With most flush draws like king 7 suited, we just check and hope to win against queen jack or a weaker flush draw. So we still have some showdown value with our king high, and we have better bluffs. That's the main point here. And jack high has pretty much no showdown value ever. And when you think about high cards, this is one of our weakest high card bluffs we arrive on the river. And those hands are usually really good bluff candidates. The other thing is, when we have king 7 suited, villain cannot have king 7 suited or king 8 suited, because we block those hands. This means that he has less flush draws in his range, and he has more ace-x and other strong hands that will bluff catch river. That's the reason why you want to block villain's calling range and always unblock his folding range. So we go for it. We go for the triple barrel, and here it's important to realize that this is a very profitable bluff. If he calls with a better hand or not is not important. On the river we can also have a second bet size. We can have an all-in range, because like I mentioned before, our opponent basically never has a strong hand. So he is fairly capped and has a lot of nice bluff catchers, but we are still uncapped. So it's a nice spot to work with two sizings on the river. We are not trying to get ace-x to fold on the river. Sure, when villain bluff catches with king 6, we should change our strategy. But overall, we just don't care. It's all about executing the correct strategy, and when you do this over and over again, you will produce a lot of EV with those plays. Just make sure you always come up with good reasons for your play, and as always, if you're unsure about your decision making process, post your hand in our Discord channel. So we open aces and we flop a somewhat good board texture. And we're going to bet range on this board texture. Not much to add. There are still so many weaker pairs and backdoors that he will call, and yeah, also two aces remain in the deck. So no need to be tricky and check. When the board texture is a range bet, we just execute. We bet small and our opponent calls. Turn is the 6 in hearts, and the question is always, should we go for the triple with aces? Do we want to bet middling type hands on the turn? When we have a middling type hand, we mainly want to check. If we bet a hand like second pair all the time, what will happen? Our opponent is just folding all the hands we beat, and he is continuing with most hands that beat us, besides a few draws usually. So we value cut ourselves when we bet those hands. But remember that those rules are super general, and as you will see in this example, it depends a lot on the board texture and villain's range. It's not always the case that second pair is a middling type hand and we should check it. Protection against flush and straight draws is not our main priority, only when we know that villain can never have any top pairs. But that's the problem. Villain can always have a lot of top pairs in his flop check call range. So if we bet the turn with middling type hands, super often we will not have more than 50% equity against his calling range, so we are basically bluffing with the best hand. But we don't need to bluff in those situations, because we have really good showdown value. No need to build a big pot with those hands, because we have better hands when we want to bluff. With pocket aces, we have, in theory, a somewhat perfect hand to check, because we block a lot of floats and we have our opponent dead quite often. And on this turn, we also don't need to protect our equity, because no draws available. He's not calling flop with a hand like 4-5 suited, and there's no overcard in the deck we have to be afraid of. So in theory, this is the perfect hand to check. And the same applies to the weaker king X hands. So king deuce suited, king deuce suited, king 3 suited, and so on. Those would also perform quite nice in our checking range. However, in practice, the player pool calls way too wide with all the second pairs, and I would prefer betting them in most player pools because we just produce a higher EV this way. When we have a somewhat good pair, so 6s to 10s, we also always want to value bet because we need to deny way more equity. And again, we get called by so many worse hands that betting turn is so much more profitable than checking turn and value betting river. As you can see, there are reasons why we want to pot control on the turn with the middling pairs and just bet really polarized. Of course, later on we could also establish a bet small and an overt range on this texture, but as I mentioned before, I would try to master the bet big range till I add another bet sizing. With these stronger pairs, queens, jacks, tens, those hands are pretty nice checks because we beat a lot of his floats and we need some hands to protect our turn checking range, so it makes more sense to value bet the smaller than the bigger pairs on the turn because the weak pairs need way more protection against his overcards. Alright, the river is the queen in diamonds. Yeah, that's an interesting card. Can we just check it down because we have a pair, or how should we approach the river situation when we have a good hand? Okay, we arrive on the river, and what should we do with our hand? When we have a strong mate hand, that's easy, right? We always value bet. As long as villain calls enough worse, we just bet. And the same applies when we check the turn and we make a weak top pair on the river. Of course, we have the best hand most of the time and we should go for a value bet when villain rarely has a better hand. And yes, sometimes our opponent has a better hand and he calls or raises, whatever, that's not a problem. We just need to make sure that we are a favorite against his calling range. And that's why tripling top pair no kicker is not the perfect strategy, cause most worse hands will fold and all the better hands are calling on the river. Most of the time when we really triple barrel, we need a strong hand like top pair, good kicker, or even a better hand. Also, take enough time for your action. Think about if your hand is still a strong hand on the river and if you can get enough value from worse. This can impact your overall win rate. No need to make snap decisions really when the pot is really big. Of course, a strong mate hand on the turn can turn into a middling type hand on the river. When we have top pair, top kicker, but the front door, flush and straight draw gets there on the river, now we have a middling type hand. And with middling type hands, we just want to check. And that's the beauty of position. When villain checks, you can just go to showdown if you want to and realize your equity. Sometimes we have the best hand, sometimes we don't, and yeah, that's totally fine for us, but we win more money by checking than by betting in this situation. He checks and we definitely have a value bet again, so we bet big and expect villain to still bluff catch with his ace jacks, pairs, and yeah, obviously all the queen x floats when he's not evaluating himself. So we bet big and now he raises. Yeah, this is not a fun spot to be in. Yes, he will have some bluffs, that's for sure, but he can also have a king, right? And you just need to ask yourself, are aces a good bluff catch candidate? Are we in our top range? Now, when we go back to the turn, I explained why we should check in theory some king x hands, cause exactly for those reasons. Cause when we have a king, the likelihood that he also has a king on the river goes down. So bluff catching even with king deuce is 10 times more probable than bluff catching with aces. And that's why it is important in theory to have some trips in your turn checking range, but not the strong ones. That's just not necessary. In reality, we can still barrel through with those hands most of the time, cause the population just calls way too wide on the turn and river, and when you can get 3 streets and he barely has a better hand, you have to go for it to extract enough value, cause there's the most money coming from. Not much you can do in those spots, so we just fold versus his river race. Alright, we move on to the next hand. We open pocket fives from the button, and the flop is king 9-5 with 2 spades. Not the best board texture, and villain has a large continuing range on this texture, and he also has a ton of strong hands and strong draws. So we want to bet big with our strong value hands and bluffs. Yeah, pocket fives, no exception. Never downsize when you have a set or 2 pair or whatever. Your opponent is still calling so many worse hands on the flop, and you give yourself the chance to play for a very, very big pot on later streets. But on this texture, we could also bet range, cause our opponent never has kings and nines and ace king and king queen suited, king nine suited, cause he's suiting those hands. But yeah, as explained, I like polarizing a bit more, so we bet big and our opponent calls. Turn now is the 4 in spades, so the front door, flush draw got there. Okay, let's move on to bet sizing. When we range bet on the flop, we want to often continue on the turn with a big sizing. When you think this particular hand is too weak to bet turn with a huge sizing, yeah, no problem, go ahead and check. The middling hands are strong enough to bet the river for value, plus we need to protect our turn checking range, because otherwise our opponent can bluff the river super effectively when we always fold to his river bet. Plus, this will also make our river bluffs more effectively, because we have middling type hands in our turn checking range that we can value bet on the river. And when we don't have that, he can just bluff catch anything on the river, cause we never have a strong or middling type hand. Especially on brick rivers, that's an important factor. Yeah, what else is a thing? Well, after range betting flop, we can continue with some small bets on the turn. This way we can extract more value from middling type hands, and also will protect our equity against all his floats, cause when we just bet small on the flop, his calling ranges are a lot of overcards, and he will always have decent equity against a lot of our middling type hands, and therefore a bet small range will definitely help. Another thing that is even more important is to include some overbets on the turn after our range bet. In general, you want to have overbets in your turn strategy when you have a nut advantage. So we can have all these super strong hands, and villain can just have bluff catchers basically. When we are overbetting, we still want to be super polarized, so we want to have nut hands and bluffs. A hand like top pair no kicker is never a good candidate to overbet on the turn, cause we have so many better hands to do this. When we want to think about bluffs, we want bluffs that block villain's strongest continuing hands on the turn. cause this way he has even more weak hands and we have more fold equity with our bet and will produce a higher EV this way. When you overbet, also include pool tendencies. Is the player pool overfolding or overcalling? If the pool deviates a lot in the one or other direction, you can exploit that. Cause I get this question all the time. When I overbet for value, they always fold. But for me, I don't think this is a problem. You can just include more bluffs in your overbet range and you're good to go. But the most important thing is for sure the first bullet point. Try to master one bet sizing first before you want to add one or two other bet sizings, cause it will get more complicated and the error potential is higher with every single bet sizing. So at first, try to focus on the situations that come up all the time and try to master them with one bet sizing. You can't value bet the turn with a 75% sizing. Like I mentioned before, go ahead and check, no problem. Alright, moving on, what happens when we polarize on the flop? Well, when we bet big on the flop, we mainly want to continue with big bets on the turn. Same ideas as before, and this time we don't want to have overbets, cause he has a way stronger range now, cause he called our big sizing on the flop, and it looks like we have a similar situation over here. So the EV of betting 75% will overall just be a bit higher. Villain checks, and we need to ask ourselves what we want to do now. Problem is that the flush got there and Villain will have some flushes cause he is defending a lot of suited hands in the big blind and will also not check raise all his flush draws on the flop. So we have to be a bit cautious when the flush gets there. We want to polarize here most of the time with a big sizing, and we don't want to have overbets on this turn cause our opponent also has a lot of nutted hands, so ace-ace suited hands. And that's the reason why we want to play a fairly polarized strategy. So the more nutted we are, the more overbetting is going on, and when our opponent also can have all the nut hands, basically no overbetting going on, as you can see here. The straight draws are always a nice candidate to bluff when we arrive on this turn, so hands like Jack 10 or Queen 10 or weak aces with a nut flush draw. So yeah, we bet big and our opponent makes the call. River is the 3 in clubs, so the perfect brick. Villain has not raised the turn, so we can discount some strong flushes from his range, cause with some strong flushes he will raise turn and bet riv. So he still has some draws and also a lot of good value hands. And now it's important to realize that we have the best hand the vast majority of the time. Ranges are still fairly wide, and now we want to polarize a bit more, cause with hands like King Queen or King Jack, I like just going to showdown. So we just bet really strong hands and airballs. As mentioned, we want to polarize now and we want to use a big sizing. But what about our bluffs? Well, like I mentioned, Jack 10 and Queen 10 are good bluff candidates, and yes, we always use the same sizing when we bluff and when we value bet. To have a profitable river bluff, make sure you have a heart in your hand. Why that? Well, you want to block Villain's calling range, and Villain will most likely call with flushes or with top pairs that also have a flush blocker. So having a heart in our hand is a huge upside. And when we don't have a spade, we should just give up and go to showdown. Our opponent will not fold enough that we can bluff profitably. And yeah, with our hand, we had big and villain calls. And it's never about our own holding. Oh, I have a set, let's get it in. This is just not how poker works. Always ask yourself for which player is this card better and how we want to construct our betting range. That's important. Okay guys, let's move on to the next hand. Also a fun one. So we open the beautiful Queen Jack in clubs from the button and the big blind defense. Flop is Ace King 7 with 2 spades. Yeah, obviously a super nice board texture for our range, and we can do multiple things on this board texture. We definitely want to bet our hand on the flop because we block a lot of his super strong hands, and we unblock a lot of draws. And yeah, besides flush draws, there are no other draws than gut shots, so Queen 10, Jack 10 and Queen Jack. On those board textures we have another advantage, cause villain can never have hands like aces, kings, ace king suited, or ace king offsuit, cause all those hands threat pre-flop with 100% frequency, and he will never ever flat those super strong hands against a button steal. The only strong hands he can have are a7, pocket 7s and king 7 suited. The next strong hand would be ace queen off, but yeah, mostly ace jack off, because even ace queen will threat pre super often. On those textures, we also want to include some overbets to put pressure on his bluff catchers. So we overbet flop. I would suggest you stick to around 150% pot when you overbet. Of course, you can overbet for any amount in theory, but 150% is super efficient in terms of value bluff ratio and which hands really try to attack or get value from. If we go way smaller or way bigger, we often have the situation that the 75% pot size bet will have a higher EV. Alright, so we overbet flop and he makes the call. The other option is to range bet flop and start with overbets on the turn, which is also totally fine and definitely a bit easier to execute. The turn is a super nice brick, it's the deuce in clubs. We would have preferred the 10 in clubs, but what can you do? Should we bet again or just check with our holding? Well, we should always think about which hands we are targeting and how our turn range looks like. On the turn, we don't want to bluff all the flush draws. For example, Queen Jack and spades is a worse bluff than betting Queen Jack and clubs on the turn. And I think for most of you that's counterintuitive, but with Queen Jack and spades, we block his turn folding range. Because on the flop he will continue with a lot of Queen X and Jack X and spades, and when we have those hands in our hand, he is folding less on the turn. So our fold equity decreases, and this means he has more Ace X hands, and that's the reason why we want to check most of the time with Queen Jacks and spades. Obviously we still want to bet some other flush draws, but not every single one. That's important. And like I mentioned, we also want to bet other bluffs besides flush draws, cause otherwise when the river is a spade, what is your bluffing range now? So hands like the gut shots with no spade are a fairly good bluff on the turn. The turn blanked and there's no need to bet small. We don't want to value bet thin now after the overbet, and it's also hard to find many hands that call the flop overbet and fold to a small turn bet. And that's why we also want to polarize on the turn, and we have the perfect candidate to this, like I mentioned. So we go for the big bet, we bet 75% pot again. The river now is the 4 in clubs, so again, no 10 in the deck for us, very sad. Yeah, villain checks, and we need to think about if we want to pull the trigger or not with our holding. And what about bastard draws on the river? In theory, we for sure have to mix and distinguish between the different draws. When we want to bluff river, for example, with a bastard open-ended straight draw, we need to think about if we block some hands from villain's calling range. Cause when we block top here, good kicker type hands, this is awesome. Cause those hands are in villain's calling range the vast majority of the time. And when we block those hands, villain has less strong top pairs and more weak top pairs, maybe second pairs, and draws in his river range. So we can bluff more probably on the river, cause villain will fold more hands to our river bet. As you can see, with those draws, we have a really profitable bluff, and we should go for it. Make sure to work with the correct ranges in those spots. When villain just flat called preflop, he cannot have a hand like aces, kings, queens, ace king, and so on. Make sure you always start on the flop with your thinking process and not on the river. So which hands call preflop, just call flop, call turn, and arrive on the river. Cause again, you need to exclude a lot of very weak hands, because those hands usually fold flop or turn, and also very strong hands, because with the best hand he is going to raise flop or raise turn quite often. So now our plan is to just barrel all the draws. And no, please don't do that, especially when you have the front door flush draw. This is probably the worst bluff hand you can barrel through. But why? Why that? Well, we block a lot from villain's folding range. We need to unblock villain's folding range when we want to bluff, cause villain will call with a lot of flush draws on the flop and on the turn. When we now have a flush draw ourselves, the likelihood that our opponent has a flush draw goes down. And that's why this is a nice candidate to give up on the river in general and not triple barrel with those hands. It's just way more profitable to use other hands for that. And what about our air? Well, if we bet turn, the same concepts as above apply. So we unblock villain's folding range, or do we block villain's calling range? The situation is a bit different when we checked the turn. With the weakest part from this range, so hands that have absolutely no showdown value whatsoever, can bluff river. Because we can still get a ton of better hands like ace high or some weak pairs to fold. The intention is never to get a second pair or a good top pair to fold, cause this will just not happen often enough. But that's the reason why we should mix between bet and check. When you bluff all your air, you bluff way too much, and our opponent can just check call and check raise everything to exploit us on the river. And also try to use your brain. Always try to break down villain's range on the flop, on the turn, and on the river. So which hands would I personally check call on the flop versus my sizing? That's a run out, so on the river I can have these or these hands, and then you can think about your best bluffs and which hands you are targeting. What are hands that will call our river bet most of the time? Well, ace jack and ace queen basically, cause those hands play exactly the same. When they call preflop, they call preflop, call flop, call turn, and call riv. And we block those hands very good, given that we have a jack and a queen in our hand. In terms of bet sizing, we want to apply maximum pressure on his bluff catchers, and we also want to get value when we have a strong hand like ace queen, for example. I would go for the overbet jam, and this is what we do with queen jack in clubs. We rip it in and we just hope that our opponent makes the fold. Like I mentioned before, when we bet some spades on the turn, those are in general the hands you want to give up on the river, because otherwise you have too many bluffs and you block villain's folding range. And never think, oh, I have ace king, I should not go all in, cause he's folding every single hand when I jam. Cause when this is really the case, you can just bluff shove river basically with anything all day long when they never ever call, but this is just not reality nowadays. Your opponent will also put you on a range of hands, and he will also realize that there are a lot of busted draws, and he will hero call with his strongest aces. Of course, no one is super happy in this spot when we get through the river and we face a jam even with a strong ace. This is not the perfect spot to be in, because villain has all these super strong hands. So on board textures that favor you a ton, you can start implementing some overbets on the flop or on the turn. Be cautious against overbets when you still play micro stakes. Often the player pool is really unbalanced, so they have way too much value and not enough bluffs. But like I mentioned before, when the player pool is trending in the one or other direction, you can start exploiting this league a bit. So when they hero call to lose, you can overbet for value a bit wider, and when they always fold to overbets, you can bluff a bit more. And when you don't know, you just stick to the standard game plan. Alright, I hope you got some new insights now. When you have additional questions, feel free to ask in our private Discord channel. And this was Follow 86 for Raise Your Edge. River is the 3 in clubs,